My name's Elizabeth Keating. I was born in Holikachuk, Alaska, on February 16th, 1933, and I lived there till 1947. There was very little white contact. My father was white. He had a store there, and during the gold rush, a few years before that, say 20 years before that, there was a lot of white contact. And because of the diseases, people moved around, and my family moved to Holikachuk. So the only white man in town was my father for a while. And then when, I talk about the devastation when the people came, when the gold miners just descended on Dishkakut, which was my family village at the time. And overnight, just within several years, over half the village was dead and gone, and the people moved out. The chief who was dying, I think my grandmother's husband, said, everybody spread, don't scatter, don't move together, because the spirits, it'll scatter the spirits. But actually, medically, it was good advice because they stopped spreading the diseases. My father struck it rich in gold, made $30,000 when he was 19 years old. Grandma said he disappeared for a couple of years. And my sister and I deduced, using different techniques, that he gambled it away. He and his friend, he was only 19 years old. He came through Canada, the Klondike and all that, and Fairbanks, Cripple Creek, down the Yukon, ended up in Dishkakut. And he married my mother and never left. And then when I was around 8 years old, we got a school, a white couple, and they were there for about 4 or 5 years. And so occasionally people came through, but there was not much. It was pretty native, and the primary language was our language, native language, Holikachuk, Athabascan, and with a few English words mixed in. When we went to school, for a while they allowed us to mix our language, and then they found out some of the kids were making fun of the teacher in native. We were told to speak only English during school. And we had no electricity, no running water. My father had some batteries and a windmill that he made, and so he could have radio, a few minutes a day. And one other family was learning to do that too while I was growing up. That's the only modernity we had. Otherwise, we had kerosene lamps, or some of us that were lucky enough, we had the gasoline lamps that were more dangerous but gave more light. Well, I was my mother's 9th child, and she was drinking fairly heavily, and she was tired, and she asked my grandparents to take me. And my father disputed that. And then he was always threatening to take me away if they didn't raise me according to his preference. So there was a lot of concern and drama, worrying that I would be taken away, and grandparents worrying I'd be taken away. I loved my grandfather. It was a second marriage for them. My grandmother had 7 or 9 children who all died in the epidemics. None of them really reached adulthood. Same way with my grandfather, he had 9 children, and they were all dead. By the time they married each other, they had no children. My mother was my grandmother's niece that she raised when my birth grandmother died. She died young and left a number of children who were taken in by other families. So the lady I call my grandmother actually was my great aunt. And then my grandfather was my grandfather by marriage. His Russian name, I guess, is Chief Alexei, and then Gasthof was his native name. You don't always know the meaning. Sometimes, like he gave me his mother's name, which is Naharina Kach, which means an excellent or outstanding seamstress. I used to sew when all young Athabascan girls were taught to sew. So I could sew clothes and, do a decent job, because your grandmother tears it out and you sew again if you don't do it right. It has to pass muster. But after I went outside, I tried to keep it up a little bit, but it became difficult because I was busy learning English and trying to catch up in school because I was way behind. Well, I was significantly indulged and spoiled, and my brothers and sisters always reminded me that I was spoiled by my grandparents. And one of my favorite stories that I'm not sure I remember accurately, but there was this man named Dominic who used to go up and down the river selling things. He had a store in Ruby, and he stopped at our fish camp. And he had a little record player, about maybe 12 by 12, and wind-up one, and then you played 78 RPM on it. And he had a big box of 78 RPMs. And Grandpa decided to buy that. And I remember $200, but $200 in that day and age would be phenomenal, you know. But he paid, as I remember it, he paid $200 and he bought the whole thing. In the springtime, we went to the bank, river bank, and he sat me down and he told me, listen, don't talk, just listen. I'll tell you when to talk. So we sat there and I listened to the birds and all the different ducks, and you know, you hear in the springtime it's just a cacophony of sound of birds, everything singing and carrying on, loons making that funny sound. And I heard the owl hooting, and as I was listening, I began to understand what it said. And it talked about the people in the village who were not well that spring, and one who might die, or who probably would die, or I forget how it was worded, but it led me to believe that that person was going to die. And then after a while, my grandfather started talking, and he asked me what I heard. And I said, it says that person's going to die. Is she going to die? And he said, well, she might. And then it talked about several other people, and I don't remember who now, but I remember that person. You know, that stayed in my mind, kind of in the back of my mind, and then a really popular book was published called I Heard the Owl Call My Name, and it really brought that back into my memory, and you know, I began to think hard about it. But he taught me other things, and he taught me to listen to sounds, and both he and my grandmother, the important thing was not to talk too much and listen. Just listen. When we did public healing, he would be in the middle of the room, and they'd have chairs, and Grandma would put blankets on it, and he would go into a trance. And then people would be sitting all around the room. And when he came out of the trance, then he sat up and people came, he would call out names and people would come and kneel before him. And he would tell them what he saw about their health needs or dietary needs. And, you know, he would tell them what they needed to do. And I remember this one woman sat before him and he said something to her that puzzled me. The next day or sometime later, I asked Grandma, what did he mean? And I don't remember it in native, but she said, well, she's practicing birth control, and he's urging her not to. And so, well, we ate a lot of natural foods, and a lot of them were medicinal. I don't remember specifically any of them, but we ate very much. And Grandma took me around one spring. She may have done that many times, but I remember one spring she said, if you're ever hungry, if there's ever a shortage of foods, she told me which plants could be pulled up and used. We didn't use it regularly, but she said those plants were edible if ever we had a shortage of meat and fish. She lived through a couple of famines in her lifetime. Well, it was a close-knit community. We weren't all related, but many were, and nobody went hungry. When food was caught, it was shared, and especially old folks who weren't as physically able to go out, if they didn't have family especially, the village looked out for them. But you know, everybody looked out for everybody. It surprises me how alienated people are now from each other in the village. That closeness that existed doesn't now to me. I might be wrong about that, but that's what I observe, and then comments I hear made. Well, I resented and denied the Irish side until I was an adult. I hated being a half-breed, which I was called a half-breed in the village all the time. But I was fully native as far as I was concerned, because I was being raised by two people who didn't speak English. And, you know, the man, the chief of the village, and my grandmother was the midwife and served medically that way. She took soup to people who were sick, and she visited the sick and took, you know, helped women have babies and stuff like that. I always felt fully native. I mean, there was in my heart and feeling I was native, but intellectually I was a half-breed. And even after I went outside, I always said I was native or half-native. My father wanted me to put down white. One time I was filling out some forms and I said, it wants to know what I am, and there was no native in there. There was no Indian, American Indian on some of the forms. And he said, well, you're white. And I said, I'm not white. And he said, yes, you are. I said, no, I'm half Indian. I want to put down half Indian. Well, I knew my Irish cousins, my aunts and uncles, and I accepted them as family. But I always told them I was native, and they never called me half-breed, but they said, well, you're only half Indian. And I said, well, that's the half I know best. And even to this day, I think, although I enjoy my Irish heritage now more, you know, I'm native who's half Irish and enjoys it. Now, I hated my parents at one point for making me a half-breed. When I was 5 years old, about 5 years old, this kid called me a half-breed, you little half-breed. And I got scared and ran home, and I said to Grandma, that guy, Simeon, called me a half-breed. I said, what's that? And I thought it was because my father baked bread, that it had something to do with my father baking bread. And she got really serious, and she said, well, you know, we were the people. I think all natives, we are the people, you know. And she said, well, there's other people that aren't the people, or I forget how she put it. So she took me to see my father, and I said, Simeon called me a half-breed. And I think he tried to explain about Irish people to me, but that went over, you know, I don't know. I just began to know that I was something, not what I thought, or something that was not pleasing to everybody. I loved my grandfather so much. I loved my grandmother too, but I had her longer. I lost him when I was 9. And my beautiful world ended, and life became hard after he died. That's what stood out in my mind for years, and still, you know, comes to my mind. He didn't let me want for anything. If he thought I wanted something, he bought it, or if he liked something he thought I ought to have, he bought it. And money was no object. Good thing we didn't have all this fancy stuff. I probably would have had to have a mansion to go in. But he really did spoil me. He died when I was 9, and my world just ended. You know, my world truly ended. From then on, life became difficult. Grandma and I were alone. And I suppose people must have helped us, but I don't remember that. I had to saw wood for our fire. I had to go, and I had a dog team. At first I had 3 dogs, and then I had 5 dogs as I got older and stronger. And I used to haul firewood and ice from the lakes for water, drinking water. I worked hard. I had a backache all the time. And a few months after I went outside, one day it occurred to me, gee, I don't have backaches anymore. Then I realized it was from working so hard that I always had a backache. It was a very hard time, and I relived her death, illness and death, for about a year in dreams. I think I dreamed about it almost every night, but nobody understood, and I didn't understand, and I was so darn busy during the day changing culturally, I didn't have time to mourn during the day. The only time I could mourn was in my dreams. within a month after I was in Seattle. I didn't even have time to grieve when I was in school, and I think I grieved for years indirectly because I never really got a chance to grieve properly the Athabascan way or anything. You have the funeral, memorial at Potlatch, and then you start preparing for a memorial potlatch. And the belief is that the spirit of person stays around the family until you have that memorial potlatch, and that's a goodbye, so that their spirit will then go on to where it's supposed to go. And you usually have that within a couple of years, and never got to do that. 55 years later, I had a potlatch for her. My good friends Henry and Dolly Deacon, Grandma was really good to Dolly when she needed help, so Dolly always saw her as a mother or a grandmother figure, I think. This one day they said, "Elizabeth, we got to have this potlatch." So I hurried, got it together, and took a year or two, but we got it done. It was both a shock and exciting. It's like a young kid going to the movie for the first time, or, you know, even an adult going to Las Vegas for the first time, you know, all the excitement. I mean, that's what I would compare it to, is like seeing when I first went to Las Vegas, all that. Well, going to the city was like that. I mean, just going from a village of 100 people to a village of or a city of a million people in Seattle, you know, people just walking like crazy back and forth. And I said to my father, "Where are they all going?" I was 14 when I went outside, and I chose the 6th grade, and it turned out to be 10 and 11-year-olds in the 6th grade, and so I had to do some work to catch up. And then going to school, everything was so different. It just was night and day. I think because my grandmother had just died, and she suffered. I mean, I don't really want to go into too much detail, but she suffered for about 7 months, dying of stomach cancer with no pain meds, no doctors, nothing. And I was alone with her that whole time. So in retrospect, that must have been a very traumatic event for me, although I just lived through it. Very changing event. And then when I realized I was in the 6th grade, and with all these little kids, I was walking to school. There was a high school girl who lived next door to us, and we walked to school every morning. And I said to her, "Evelyn, what am I going to do? You know, I'm a teenager, and those are little kids." And she said, "Well, maybe they have summer school." I said, "How would I find that?" And she's "Go talk to the principal." So I went and talked to the principal, and I said, "You know, I'm 14 and I'm in the 6th grade. And, you know, I'll be 21 or something like that when I graduate. How can I get into school?" Somebody said there's summer school. He came back to me and said there was no regular summer school, but there was a school in Bellingham, which was 50 miles away, but it was more like a daycare for school teachers having to go to summer school to, you know, make up degree requirements. And I said, "Well, if that's all there is," he said, "I could get you into that." I said, "Well, maybe at least I'll learn something, you know." And I was still learning English, you know, because I didn't speak English well. 50 miles, how am I going to get back and forth? And, you know, it's just like I had divine guidance or leadership or something. I went across to the neighbor that I visited every day. She was a school teacher. She taught the 3rd grade. And I said, "Hey, Maxine, I want to go to summer school in Bellingham, and the principal got me in, but I don't know how to get there." She said, "Well, I have to go to summer school, so you can ride with me." So maybe I waited till the 2nd or 3rd day, and I talked to the teacher, and I said, "You know, I'm 14 and I'm only in the 6th grade. I'm going into the 7th grade. And I was hoping there was something I could do to advance a little more." And so, as luck would have it, she had 2 student teachers that were going to student teach in her class. So she assigned each one to me for different subjects. And I attended class some of the time with the little kids, but I spent the time getting private schooling from these 2 student teachers. About the last week of school, she said, "Have your principal come and see me." He happened to be going to summer school too. So, and I told her my dreams. And I did everything I was told. I worked hard no matter how scared I was. I did what I was told, and that's the best I could. So she, after they talked, they said to me that he would let me in high school for 6 weeks. And that was when semester grades came. If I had passing grades, I could stay in high school. If I didn't have passing grades, I'd have to go back to the 7th grade. You never saw anybody work so hard in your life. All the high school teachers, I'm sure, were impressed at what a studious kid I was. Well, I passed. And after that, I went home. Yeah, I didn't start college till 25 years later. I wanted to go to college, but I was scared, actually. I didn't know how to apply for, nobody told me. So, and there was no college in Oak Harbor, the little town I was in. And I was scared to go to the University of Washington. We moved to Seattle with that massive school. Well, I ran the Seattle Indian Center for a few years. I was nervy, you know. I learned not to be afraid. I mean, no matter how afraid I was, I learned to just do things, just go through the fear. And so I just, on a kiss and a promise, I got the directorship of the Seattle Indian Center. And we went from $22,000 a year to $1.5 million in a year's time. I hired people smarter than me. That's one of the things I always did in all my jobs, is I hired people who knew more than I did about things, and I'd tell them, I know you're smarter than me, but I'm the boss. And, you know, so we did fine. So this kid comes to see me, he's a young Indian guy that I kind of befriended, and he said, Elizabeth, have you finished college? I said, no, I haven't even been to college at all. And it was right after the civil rights, and they were creating schools for adult minorities, particularly blacks, to get degrees. So if you could drum up 2 years of something, you go to college for 2 years, night school for 2 years, you got a degree from Western Washington. I had to have people help me hunt and drum up, and you know, we used some of the work I did at the Seattle Indian Center. And then I had taken correspondence courses from this one new college called the Evergreen State, which is a longtime college now, but it was new at the time. And they happened to have an Indian professor. So she drummed up a year of college for me. And then with my Seattle Technical School colleges, we cobbled together something that looked like 2 years of college. So then I went to night school for 2 years and got my bachelor's from Western Washington University. So then I went to Fairbanks to run the Fairbanks Native Association. So my girlfriend, who was working for me, was going to college for a master's. She already had one master's, so she's going for another master's. And I said, how many masters do you want? But anyway, she said, you should take this course. They need a native taking it. It's a counseling course that's supposed to develop sensitivity to the counselor so that they'll learn how to work with natives more effectively. So she'd come and see me every once in a while. Pretty soon, the director of the program, it was called Community Psychology, Dr. Richard Katz came to see me, and several other people, and they asked me to take the course for nothing. My job was to make it culturally sensitive. I nearly got kicked out of the program. Well, I said, there's nothing cultural about this thing. It's a white counseling course. They created a committee, and we worked, and we tried, and other Indian professors worked with me, helped to try to make it more culturally sensitive. Dr. Katz was leaving, and he said, Elizabeth, I know you won't graduate if you don't graduate while I'm here. You're going to graduate while I'm here. So I had been working on my thesis, so another professor, a native professor, helped me write my thesis. I wrote the guts of it. It's a native thesis, but she edited it, and I got my degree. I told Dr. Katz, when the counseling course, I said, I can't stop working. I have to keep working. So they agreed, but then they regretted agreeing. But anyway, they let me graduate. But like I say, I don't feel like they're fully valid degrees because I don't feel like I had to work very hard. I had to fight politically, but I mean, I know how to fight politically without a degree. That's my career. Oh, it's just dramatic. Here, when my husband and I were here in the summer of 1961, we spent the summer in this area. And we used to drive to Portage Glacier. And there were mountains, you couldn't see any water. There were mountains of, I mean, huge mountains of blue ice. And now it's all water. And you have to drive over and hike up if you want to get to it. If you could, I haven't seen it in recent years, but you know, it's just dramatic. And going home, we lived on the wide part of the Yukon River in the summertime, my family. And there are two huge islands with trees and forest that have grown, that weren't there. Nothing, it was just water when I was a kid. I said, holy cow. So are you sure this is from the village I used to live in, Holikachuk? It's just a little strip of land now. The people moved away to Grayling because the river was cutting away. It's almost done cutting it. And there was a lake in back that they called Shoehorn Lake, Horseshoe Lake, and it connects into another slough. Pretty soon, the land my village was on, I don't know how many years, I don't think too many, will be gone. There will be no Holikachuk land left. It's just amazing. And the whole world, it isn't just Alaska. Even the Rock of Gibraltar is changing. I was reading some article about how land has changed, and there's one part near Greece where an island, I think it's, if I remember correctly, it's gaining 2 feet of land a year. I think the earth will carry on. And I just, you know, I told them to live a good life, be good to other people. They're all outside, none of my well, I have 4 grandchildren here in Anchorage. But I tell them, live a good life, you know, be honest in your dealings, be upstanding, and don't be greedy, get an education. Well, I only remember words and phrases now, but I spoke it fluently, and it was my first language because my grandparents, who didn't speak English, raised me. So I learned that first, and always mixed in English because I had frequent contact with my dad. Well, Doyon Languages, Doyon, which is the Native Corporation, has a foundation that they created, and so Doyon Foundation got a big language grant, 3-year grant a few years back. And there are 9 dialects in their region, and nobody speaks our language anymore. Nobody, the last fluent speaker died a few years ago. And I always remembered phrases. At one time I tried to forget my language and I succeeded. I tried to forget everything about Native. I just wanted to be a human being. And so I deliberately forgot my language. But except I remembered a few phrases which I taught my kids when they were, but I couldn't remember enough to teach them by the time I had them. And I found out Doyon had this program. I asked, who's doing Holikachuk, which is my dialect? And they said, nobody. And so I wrote to them and I said, I don't really speak my language, but I know a few phrases, and I remember the way, it's tonal and guttural, and I remember all that. And so they invited me, and then using, UAF has been documenting some language with all the people in Doyon region, and so my language is documented by a few elders. And so listening to the elders brought back a lot of it, and then they hired a professional team from back east, which I think was a mistake. But they told us we had to say the words and phrases they told us. I recorded for a couple of years phrases and words that they gave me. And then we needed a man, so they hired a guy from upriver Nulato, which speaks a different dialect, but some similar words. If you understand one language, you can, converse with the other. So we spoke back and forth, and that's recorded. A lot of it is recorded, but the problem is that to speak fluently would be difficult. What I was doing is when I want to say something and I know some of the words, I call somebody in another village that knows their language, and I say, this is what I'm trying to say in my language. How would you, place the words? I don't know how you say that in English, but, like, I want to go dancing. How would, and I say dancing, I want to go. I mean, how do you, so then they help me that way. I think if people want to relearn the language in our village, that's what they'll have to do. They'll have to get help from other villages in phrasing. Language is what makes you who you are, I think. Oh, it's already lost. Our culture, our songs, our beliefs, the overall subsistence is there, but the basics, let's say in English, our Father, if you forget one or two phrases, you've lost some essence, and we've lost the basic essence of our culture. And I don't know if it'll ever be fully recouped, I don't know, and I don't know if it matters. And what I've been asking myself in the last 20 years is, there are many cultures throughout history that have died totally. They're still looking for that Princess Cleopatra. They've never found her grave. And I think all that's been lost over history, and I suppose we'll be like that. I don't know, 100 years from now, if the earth is even here. But I think I leave it to the Great Spirit to take care of that. That's not my pay grade. November 17th, 1986. That's my AA birthday. I was very suicidal after I finished high school. I thought about ways to commit suicide. I did not like life out there, and there wasn't a life to go home to anymore, really. And this one night, I was dreaming about my grandfather, and I don't remember the dream. It was such a shock when I woke up. Then I jolted awake, and his face was right here, and it just gradually faded away across the room. I mean, his face was, and I got up, it was around 4 or 5 in the morning, and I knocked on my dad's door, and I told him, and I said, God, I just could see him, And he said, oh, you were just dreaming, it wasn't real. I don't know what he said to me or what went on in the dream, but it was pretty jolting, or I don't know what the right word is, shocking. And I think I stopped thinking about suicide for a while. I think when I was 24, I decided, well, what am I going to do, I was tired of being unhappy all the time. I mean, people didn't know I was unhappy, I presented this persona. So at 24, I decided, I've got to make up my mind. Either I'm going to live and learn to enjoy this life, or find some other life. And going back home was not optional at the time. I decided to become a Catholic. And so I took classes and became a Catholic. And then I said to Father, I'm 24 years old. I'd like to meet some guys. I wanted more suitable boyfriends. So he said, well, there's a group called the Chancellor Club. That's for young Catholics who are, And I joined them, and I had a marvelous time for a year. Then I married my husband. It was gradual. I drank a lot and partied a lot in high school. All the kids were drinking then. There wasn't much drugs. One kid was doing pot, but all the rest of us were kind of afraid of it, and we didn't want to try it. I live in a Navy town, so a lot of kids passed through. So I partied a lot, and I sometimes thought about my mother dying from alcoholism, but it seemed far away at the time, and And we didn't know, there wasn't much known about alcoholism. In the Chancellor Club, there was heavy-duty drinking and partying. You know, we partied a lot. But when I got married and started having kids, I didn't drink anymore. I mean, once in a while we would go out and we'd drink, you know, with people. But when my last baby was born, 1970, I started cooking with wine sometime that year. I got a recipe that required wine. And I started taking a sip. And man, it felt good. Just that one little sip of wine felt great. And I started doing that. And next thing you know, a few years later, I realized I was hooked to that, you know. But I still was not a heavy drinker. The marriage wasn't happy towards the end, and we separated, and I began drinking more. And then I really, within a year, I think, after we separated, I was really heavy-duty alcoholic. And I was like that for a number of years, but I always had jobs. My oldest son, was impressed. He said, God, you could drink like a horse and be a drunk and still run all those agencies. And I said, well, I just hired good people. Then I was beginning to know I was dying, you know, that my brain was beginning to hurt in a way. I don't have headaches, never have had much headaches, once in a great while with the flu. But my brain began to hurt, that I knew I was damaging my brain. I was going to AA. I was trying to stop for I probably tried to stop for 5 or 6 years or more. I mean, all the time I knew I was drinking too much. And I read about this guy who developed that alcoholic dementia. And I knew from the headaches I was having, they weren't headaches, they were brain aches, that I probably would develop that. And I got scared. I didn't want to walk around mumbling to myself. You know, I still respected my grandparents and their image, and I didn't want the image of their granddaughter who they raised becoming alcoholic dementia. And I was begging my grandfather to help me, and he would. I'd stop for 2 or 3 weeks at a time based on, I'd beg him to take away the craving. And I'd stop for a week or 2 at a time. The longest I went, I think, was 3 weeks. But then I'd take that one drink. Well, of course, one drink for an alcoholic. I was living in Fairbanks. This friend of mine ran a youth alcoholic program here in Anchorage called Youth Prevention Program. And she was putting on this gathering, and it turned out to be the alcoholic people. And that's how I sobered up. Then the next year we put on the same thing in Fairbanks, and we sobered up a lot of people. It kind of became a movement for a while. It was wonderful. But now we've lost the momentum, and I'm worrying about the younger people. The alcohol is out of control, and other drugs too, unfortunately. And those are worse. Even elders are addicted and buying the drugs they need that the doctors won't give them anymore on the streets. Well, it was really interesting. The Alkali Lake people, Andy and Phyllis, came, and lots of people from there came, and Phil Lane was the master of ceremonies of this, and his dad was still living, and gave a talk, and it was, I'd say, 400 or 500 people in the school stadium here. And it went on every day, all day Saturday. I think something went on Friday night, all day Saturday, all day Sunday. And then Sunday afternoon, they put on a Sioux pipe ceremony that was conducted with Phil and his dad and Andy Chelsea. And we danced, one inside circle went one way and the outside circle. And as we were on the outside, and we took a puff of the pipe. And I had been begging for a miracle, and my grandfather gave me a few, but I didn't stay with those. But at this one, it was just like a miracle. I never wanted another drink. I could go to bars, I could do things, never drink, never desired it. I have to say it must be spiritual. I don't know. It's spiritual, because the pipe ceremony is a spiritual thing and carries a lot of power with it. The other way to do it, and a lot of people use it, is either an AA or there's treatment centers, there's counseling centers, there's all kinds of programs that people can avail themselves of. And even in their own village, two people can get together and start talking. And well, I think the beginning where, well, Andy stops drinking, and then Phyllis, I forget, Phyllis stopped. I think Phyllis stopped first, and then Andy, I forget. But Phyllis they had a 7-year-old daughter, and they left her with the grandma, and they went shopping or something. And when they came to pick her up, she refused to go home with them because she didn't want that drinking. And it shocked Phyllis that her daughter didn't want to come home with her. And you see her pouring that bottle down the drain and crying. And that impressed me because my kids hated me drinking. And then Andy, I remember him sitting with the priest or somebody, counselor, and saying, it's been a year and something like nobody's coming. And, he was encouraged to keep it up. And then finally the third woman came, I forget her name, Bilyeu is her last name, I think. And it began to grow from there. And it took them, as I understand it, 14 years to reach the 95% sobriety. Then I heard a few years later that the young people growing up now were beginning to experiment a little bit, but I haven't kept up with what's going on with them. Andy and Phyllis came here a few years ago, well, quite a few years ago, about 15 years ago, and I sat with them and thanked them and told them that they sobered me up. Well, it's problematic. There are people sobering up. My little elders group, this Sober Mute and the elders group, that's part of it, related to it. Two separate organizations, but related to each other. With Sober Mute, sobriety was the issue, and Sober Mute did bring Andy and Phyllis up a few years later. That's when I saw them and how I got to know Sober Mute and joined it. And then we have the little elders group. We hold at least one potlatch a year, and we strive to do 3 if we can get the money, raise the money. That's related to sobriety. And this year we have 3 women that came forth in those, and that 3 is better than nothing, that's everything, And they're active now in the group to try to help other people. It's a long, slow job. When we were here, I think it was about 500 people attended. At least half of us, I think, sobered up. And they gave you sticks, and you were supposed to go back to your community and plant it. Instead, I carried it in my purse for about 3 years, because I figured this was where it needed to be planted. So my daughter still talks about that, my prayer stick, she called it. My youngest son still has a problem. He's sober right now, but it's been off and on for years. But my 2 older children do not drink at all. And my son who died drunk, I think. Somebody killed him though. And my grandkids, lots of them don't drink. A couple of them have had problems, but they're striving not to drink. And I tell them my story all the time. Best thing is never to start. Because I told my kids, we have a weakness for alcohol. Our bodies can't handle it. Native bodies weren't designed to handle alcohol, and it's not good for us. It's a poison for us, and we should look at it that way. Of course, that first drink feels so marvelous. My liver was affected, so I think it probably took a couple of years for the liver to heal. I don't know, but at some point I asked the doctor, how's my liver? And he said, it seems fine. My brain suffered. I think it seems to work pretty well now, but I live a pretty spiritual, personal life. I mean, I swear and carry on. You'd never know I was spiritual, but I used to drive dog team. That's my excuse. I learned to swear and never learned not to. But I eat as healthy as I can, because it's not that I want to live forever. I told my doctor, I said, I just want to die healthy. I just want to quit breathing one day or whatever, whatever quits on me. I don't want to suffer along, so I try to stay healthy, and thank goodness I'm succeeding somewhat. My brain could use a little more help, and walking, and I think that's my brain, that balance issue is probably related. I think everything, the brain is the motor that operates the body, basically, so, if you keep your brain healthy, then you're doing pretty good. Well, I formally left the Catholic Church after 10 years, and I decided to explore my native spirituality. And as luck would have it, I just kind of blessed along the way. As I think I want to do something, it gets presented to me in some form. My husband found this book about the underground witchcraft or stuff going on in Seattle, and I recognized so much of it. And there was a church, spiritual church down the road from us. I didn't want to join it, but I attended it a couple of times, and I started meeting those spiritual people, and then I began to read about yoga and Eastern philosophies, which I found so consistent and similar to my own native beliefs. And then I took yoga for a couple of years. I mean, I dabbled in things, and then, always stayed in touch with my grandfather and asked for guidance along the way. And I guess spiritual beliefs is just believing in we called it the Great Spirit, and that everything has a living spirit, and you treat all living things with respect. I see God, or, the Great Spirit, as light, and life, and so I pray every day in my way and acknowledge and pray for the world in peace and love.